Kristen, thank you very much. Thank you for making yourself available to be here today, and thank you for playing such beautiful music. The family had originally asked me to play the harp, and I wanted to, but it turns out my instrument is in storage, so Kristen was kind enough to fill in. So thank you. Welcome. Welcome to Redlands United Church of Christ. We are here to celebrate the life and the love and the family and the friends and the accomplishments and maybe even the struggles of Carole and Wesson. I have a question, and any of the family members are not eligible for voting. Is there anything wrong with this slide that you see up on, that is a photograph of Carole? Is there anything wrong with that you see? Michael, you cannot vote, so sorry. There's no E. So what we're doing is testing to see if you are gracious and forgiving right at the very beginning. So on behalf of Sandra and myself and others who put this together, I apologize for this mistake on this slide. And I understand that when Carole introduced herself to some persons here in the church community, she said, "My name's Carole with an E." I'm new, that didn't really pass all the way down to me. I apologize, and thanks for everyone who's helped with this service, and thanks for the hardworking folks who have put together and organized the food that was delivered and helped set up. I'm really grateful for all of our volunteers today. We understand that in a service like this, we gather to offer support and care to loved ones. It's also an opportunity for us to open our hearts and our minds. We sometimes look at our own mortality. We may question or wonder about our own understanding about death, our beliefs about life or afterlife. The faith community here is fond of questions, and we are unafraid of holding space for different answers. We are glad that you are here. We're grateful that you are here to support Craig and William and Anne-Marie and others who are here from the family. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for your relationship with Carole, and thank you for participating in this service. We also are in this place and a part of this community because we are looking to claim the promises of faith. Those promises are about our well-being, our safety, in some cases our redemption, and certainly for all of us, some forgiveness for those things that we are concerned about or that we might regret. And we also, as a community of faith, are a community that looks for renewal. We are on the watch for new life and consider ourselves a part of a wider community and want to lift up that new life as we see it and as it occurs around us. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, I give you thanks for siblings in faith, for persons of all faiths, for persons of any background, persons of no faith. We are siblings in creation, and we are together in this community and the wider community of Redlands and beyond. We give you thanks for the life and work and relationships and love of Carole and Wesson. In our need, in our sadness, in any wonder or anger that we may experience, we ask your presence, and we ask for comfort, imagination, and peace. May Carole know the love that we share in this community, and may she experience your enduring care in whatever form and whatever shape that takes. Gracious God, be present with us. We give you thanks for being with us. And together God's people say, Amen. This is a poem by Mary Oliver, who many of you may know was a Pulitzer Prize winner. This is from a collection entitled Dream Work, and it's from 1986. The reason that I'm choosing this poem is that I live in the studio that's adjacent to the Wesson house, where Craig now lives and has been kind enough to put me up for 5.5 months. And my dog and myself take a walk each morning around the property. That's the dog's choice, not my choice. Otherwise, he begins to chew on parts of my body. And it is a beautiful piece of property, and there are reminders of Carole and Craig's life together. The swimming pool, the area where the solstice bonfires took place. There's still some ashes that my puppy likes to chew on and carry around. There are some beautiful wildflowers, and this poem reminded me more than any other that I looked at this week of what I learned about Carole when speaking with Anne-Marie and with Craig and with William. It's entitled The Sunflowers, Mary Oliver. Come with me into the field of sunflowers. Their faces are burnished discs. Their dry spines creak like ship masts. Their green leaves, so heavy and many, fill all day with the sticky sugars of the sun. Come with me to visit the sunflowers. They are shy, but want to be friends. They have wonderful stories of when they were young, the important weather, the wandering crows. Don't be afraid to ask them questions. Their bright faces, which follow the sun, will listen. And all those rows of seeds, each one a new life, hope for a deeper acquaintance. Each of them, though it stands in a crowd of many, like a separate universe, is lonely. The long work of turning their lives into a celebration is not easy. Come, and let us talk with those modest faces, the simple garments of leaves, the coarse roots in the earth, so uprightly burning. I'm grateful that Sophia, our regular church pianist and accompanist, is here. She had to dash out of school where she teaches and knew Carole and loved Carole, and I'm grateful that she's here to play. While William is coming forward, I wanted to thank William and Craig and Anne Marie for putting together this wonderful obituary, which was submitted to the local paper, but is reprinted here on the third and the final page of your bulletin. So please do have a look at that. What a remarkable woman and what a remarkable life. And I appreciate you all putting together this narrative. And thanks to William for being willing to speak today.
Hello, everybody. Hi. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and in support of our family and in remembrance of my mom. She touched many lives, as is evident from everybody who's here. And I know we all have our unique encounters and memories with Carole, with my mother, with your aunt, and your mother and wife, friends. So, I have some remarks prepared, and please forgive me if I leave things out. I did my best, and let it suffice. So, Carole Wesson, my mother, as many of you know, she was born in Thomasville, Alabama. Her mom was a church organist and taught music at the local high school. Her dad was a businessman. He was the vice president of a local regional department store called Bedsoul's Dry Goods, who my mother frequently pointed out, because he knew how to type, did not get sent to World War II and World War I in Europe. He was part of the company, but he got to choose because he could type, so he stayed in the U.S. And her family was very Victorian growing up, and she carried that with her throughout her life. As many of you have been to her dinner parties, and she enjoyed nothing more than getting out the fine china and the crystal glasses and being a good hostess that she was, and she had clear visions for the meals, and she knew what each dish was going to be, and she'd plan it all out and make it so. And then we'd all wash up afterwards. That's where I first learned about group cleanup. So she grew up, and so her mom played the piano, but she learned how to play the piano, but not from her mother. She never wanted her mother to teach her piano. She had to do that somebody else. And she also played the mellophone in the marching band, and she was a cheerleader in their high school. I don't know how many of you knew that, but that's the case. Yeah, she was a cheerleader. And and it was from her mother that she learned to entertain, because her mom would put on, I guess, big elaborate meals, and everybody would get together. And so there's one story that my mom is very fond of saying. So the woman who was preparing the turkey, I guess it was Thanksgiving or Christmas, some big meal, came out with the turkey and it slid onto the floor. And so right away, without missing a beat, her mother said, "Go get the other turkey." And so the woman who was cooking picked up the turkey, went in the kitchen, brushed it off, and brought it back out. Yeah. And so my mom inherited that wit and quick thinking and displayed it to great effect. So it was a foregone conclusion that my mom would go to college, which she did, and that's where she met Craig, who would become her husband. It was at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And she told my father, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, that two of the many reasons that she married him was because, one, he had a plan, and two, she knew it would be an adventure. And it was. However, Carole, always the pragmatic one, was determined to prove to herself that she could support herself. So before they got married, she finished college with a teaching credential in high school math. So she became a math teacher at high school in Birmingham. So my dad was doing a surgical training. Craig was doing a surgical training. And then it wasn't long after that they got married. And while he was finishing his surgical training, my mother supported them both by teaching high school math. And she found them a place to live in Birmingham. It was the second floor apartment of a beautiful old building that had a hitching post for horses outside. And I'm sorry, Dad, if I get this story a little wrong. I'm doing the best I can. And it had a marble staircase. It was on a corner, and it was a very, from the 1800s or something? Turn of the century, so 1900, early 1900 building. And I believe it had been condemned, and so the rent was cheap. Carole was never one to pass up a bargain. And so they had the whole second floor. It was a big apartment. And one night, my dad, it was through medical school, I think, that you knew the Greek people, was that right? How did you meet the Greek people? Okay, so there was a Greek family, and they came, and they brought all their friends, and they were drinking and having a good time. This is before Anne Marie was born, so they didn't have any kids, and they were dancing and drinking the hasifa, which is a Greek dance that's kind of like a conga, I've been told, and involves a lot of stomping. And at one point, someone was throwing around some torpedoes, as my dad said, that made a lot of noise. And the next day, my mom went downstairs to apologize to the two old ladies who were sisters and their brother. They were named Wesson. And they said, "Oh, we didn't hear a thing." So, and it's unknown whether it's because they were really that deaf or they were just too polite to acknowledge what had been going on. So my parents used to love to travel. And my dad was stationed in Germany, and he brought his, were you 2, Anne Marie, at the time? 18 months. So my mom, with an 18-month, my dad went over first, and it was in Bamberg. And then my mother, with little Anne Marie and herself, on her first flight, her first airplane flight ever, my mom flew to Germany. This was in, what was the year, 1963? Yeah, 1963. And so they flew to Germany, and that was a big adventure. So my mom was right about that. It was a big adventure, and they went to Germany. And so they had vacation time, and on this vacation time, they would like to travel, and they took Anne Marie with them. They rode all over Europe in their little Volkswagen Beetle, and uphill and down, and my mom said they used to race. They'd see another Volkswagen, they'd race and see who could make it up the hill first. And so one time, though, they were in Zaragoza, which is a small town. Did you say northern Spain? Okay, it's kind of northeastern Spain. And it was getting dark, and it was a mid-sized city, but they stopped they needed a place to stay. And so my dad went inside and said, "Can you," with Carole, he went inside with Carole and Anne Marie, and he said, "Do you have a room?" And they said, "Yeah, we got a room." And so my dad said, "Great." And so he went around to get the suitcases, and he came back, and "Oh, we don't have a room. We let that one." And so my mom, with her 18-month-old, or maybe 2 years old by that time, daughter, and with her University of Alabama Spanish, made it very clear to the clerk that she was not going to put up. Here I am with a 2-year-old, and she made it just loud enough so that the surrounding people could hear what was going on. And so with that matronly fierceness and quick wit, she was able to, "Oh, yes, we have a room." And so they coughed up a room. It wasn't a usual room, but it did the job. And so, where are we? So they stayed in Europe and enjoyed traveling all around their home. My dad was stationed in Germany. And I should know, that's where they met the Belotes. Thank you so much for coming. They met the Belotes over in Europe, right? In Germany? Yeah, and so and that relationship has endured. So they returned to Birmingham, and my mom then continued teaching, continuing to support and supplement the income. And my dad, at some point in there, was doing autopsies, and he made money doing that. And my mom was making money teaching, and he was finishing his medical training. And then so upon completion of his medical training, he was looking around for a place to work, and he found the Beaver Medical Clinic here in Redlands. And so they came to Redlands. And at that time, my mother felt secure enough because my dad was able to make enough money, and so she could retire from teaching and focus on raising Anne-Marie and then 3 subsequent foster children. And that was a very important thing for her. And I'm sure you remember Stephanie and Raymond. And I don't know if you all met Rebecca, but she was a little baby that they looked after for a while. But one story that my dad, I hope you don't mind me telling the story, is they went fishing with Stephanie, who is, 2 years younger than you, Anne-Marie? 2 or 3. And Stephanie caught a fish, and Anne-Marie, who didn't have much interest in fishing, right away grabbed a rod and reel and caught like 2 or 3 fish all at once. So that's that story. And along with moving to Redlands, though it was far from Alabama, she would go back to visit and keep in touch with her sister and her brother, both of whom were very important to her throughout her life. And as some of you know and some of you may not know, at one point her brother had a stroke, and I was probably around 4. And he spent time at his sister's in Roswell, Georgia, and then he came out to live with us. And so my mom had to manage basically 2 4-year-olds because my uncle was having to relearn how to get along in the world with one side of his brain completely deteriorated. And so she had, and all I could say was 1 2 1 2, but he could get everything across with that 1 2 1 2. Everything he needed to say, especially if there was a little kid running around that might knock him over, and my mom would have to go there and say, "Now, boys." So she negotiated that, and she cared for her family a great deal. That was so important to her. But another thing that, is in terms of adventure, so my dad came out here, and he met a gentleman, some of you know, Niels West, an orthopedic surgeon at Beaver, and he's the one who exposed my dad to horse riding. And so he said, let the horse do its thing as they were going down a knife edge hill. There's a path about this big and then steep sides. And he said, just let the horse do its thing and you'll be fine. What? Oh, don't interfere. That was the exact words. Don't interfere with the horse. And so he did. And then that led to a number of camping trips in the mountains, and my mom would worry about him. But she put up with it, and it also led to my dad participating in the Tevis Cup, which is a 100-mile endurance ride. And my mom and my sister and Stephanie went up to crew for him, which means they drove a big red truck around from place to place and day and night, meeting my dad at various places, and dirt roads and everything. And she did that. She did that, even though it maybe wasn't her favorite thing to do, but it was important to her husband, and that was the deal. And so she went. How many times did she do it, once or twice? She did it once. So once, and that was enough. And so and later on, when fast forward a number of years, and my dad and I are on a canoe trip in Canada, and she was ready to call the Canadian mounted police, to send a float plane over the river to look for us, but it didn't. We made it back like a day before that happened. So, and we were over 2 weeks late. So, a lot of rain and wind slowed us down, and we were down to our last meal. But my mom survived that. She survived that, and. So backtracking a little bit, going back in time again, Anne-Marie was 6th and 7th grade. She and a couple of her friends would gather at their various friends' pools, and they'd put on water ballets. They'd practice and organize these water ballets, and my mom and the other ladies would be very supportive. So that was an integral part, too, of my mom, was supporting her children and her daughter in whatever, and being present for that. And she also helped Anne-Marie make costumes. She was an excellent seamstress, and she made costumes for Halloween, parties, high school musicals, and at one point an Elizabethan gown that my sister was trying to sew, but needed some help with it, so my mom helped her with that. And my mom enjoyed making clothes, and she taught Anne-Marie how to sew. She also appreciated fabric and needlework of all kinds, and was a lifelong interest for her. And she would buy fabric and keep it for something, and use it later or let Anne-Marie use it. So my mom is also an excellent cook. I appreciate this now, having 2 children of my own who I'm called on to cook for from time to time, and through my time living at the Zen Center, how important cooking is. And it's where people come together and eat. And you mean in the Zen tradition, the Tenzo is the cook, and that's considered one of the most important positions at the temple. And so the person who cooks the food really has a big responsibility to keep people healthy, keep them well fed. And my mom was really good at that, and also make it taste good. And her signature dishes, if I had to, I'll name 4, but turkey gumbo. After every time we had a turkey afterwards, she'd take it, put it in a big pot, throw some carrots and onions in there, and cook it. And that'd be turkey gumbo. And she would add okra in it to make it thick. That's what she used, okra. And then, of course, another one was okra and tomatoes that she would grow in her garden. She would take the okra, cook it with the tomatoes, and serve it over rice and some vegetables on the side, and that'd be a meal. And then no Southern meal is complete without cornbread. And she would make cornbread just like her mother did, and probably her mother before her, and her mother's mother's mother, and so on. And she was not afraid of trying new things either. She got both of the Julia Child's French cookbooks, volumes 1 and 2, and she made beef bourguignon, and she would cook that, and that was always a treat. So, and she was also, she would allow us children to do brave things, even though she would worry. She still let it happen. And as an example of that, how old were you when you went on that bike trip, Anne-Marie? So 12 or 13. 12 or 13, my sister went with the YMCA on a bike trip. It was in the North Coast, right? Down Highway 1, which if you're not familiar with Highway 1, it's right on the coast, and there's about this much room between you and the cars, and this much room between you and the cliffs. And if my mom later on said if she'd known that, she probably wouldn't have okayed it. But she did, and my sister had a good time. And another thing that was very important was family history. There were many stories passed down, and I'll share 2. I believe, and anyone correct, Mary Emily Statz is that woman on the wall, right? Yes. So she was, I'm not sure exactly how, I think it's 3 greats, great-great-great-great-great-grandmother in Vicksburg, right, Virginia, right? Mississippi, Vicksburg, Mississippi, thank you. And so one story is that they were having a ball, and she got some cheesecloth together, and they had people sew lightning bugs into the cheesecloth, and that was her ball gown. So, and the other story is so this is during the Civil War, or as my mom would refer to it, the war between the states, because that's how it was referred to at that time in that part of the world. The Yankees were coming through, and so she threw her silver down the well, and she wouldn't let the Yankees drink from the well because she didn't want them to steal the silver. That's one version. The other version is she was just mean and didn't want them to drink from the well. So I don't know which is true. Maybe some of my cousins have a better idea than I do. I don't know. But my mother was also a strong believer in the value of civic engagement. And from her early time in Redlands, she was involved with the Assistance League. That was a big thing, and she volunteered time. And I don't know exactly what she did with them because I was little. Do you know, Emery, what did she do? Okay, so for those of you who may not have been able to hear, the Assistance League helped people get dental care who needed it in the city of Redlands, and she was involved in that. And then later on, she was involved in she was on the board of the Christian Counseling Service, and she was intimately involved with the Redlands Symphony Orchestra and the Spinet, and this was a part of her lifelong love of music. And of course, she sang in the choir here at the church until she was no longer able. Music was a very important part of her life, and she passed that on to me and to my children who are now playing music as well. So somewhere in there I was born. And from day one, she had great care for me. And there's some photos, I couldn't find them when we were going through the photo album, but there's photos of her with me as an infant that are just touching. And so Anne-Marie was a girl. and and she was from what I understand, she was a good child. And so my parents thought they were great parents. I'm afraid I shattered their illusion. One example of that is, when I was a kid, I guess I was about 4 or 5, I had some tools, and among them was a little child-sized hammer, but it was a real hammer with a metal head and a wooden handle, and I'd go around and hammer things. And there was one light socket switch, you know how they're made of these, they're made of plastic, and my mom left it where I'd sat there and hammered on it until it broke, just to see, I guess, how many blows it could take before it finally broke. And she left it there as long as I can remember, just as a witness to, see what you did when you were a kid. There were marks in the wall from the hammer too, so she did that. And she was always interested in keeping track of how tall we were too. She had a plate, and I'm sure everybody does this, but you have a place next to the refrigerator, you mark your height, and that was there for years. So entertaining, she loved entertaining. We'd always have guests for Christmas and Thanksgiving. In fact, J.D. Hart, who's here somewhere, there he is. His parents and my parents were great friends. They were neighbors, and John and Virginia Hart would frequently come over for Christmas or Thanksgiving, and we'd all share a meal together. And then no portrait of my mom is complete without mention of her garden. She grew up, her mother had a garden, and her father had grown up on a farm, but he wanted nothing more to do with farming as soon as he was able to get out of it, which is why he became a businessman. But he still, in spite of that, they had a cow, and my mom was fond of saying the cow knew how to turn on the water with its horn on the other side of the fence. It would turn on the water, and then it would drink, but then it wouldn't turn it off. It didn't care about that, so the water would just run. And then her mother, apparently, they had chickens. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But gardening. Her mother had a big garden. And so my mother, as soon as she had enough space and industry around, she planted a garden every year until she couldn't. She'd grow tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, lettuce, collard greens, and anything else she had in mind too. Cucumbers, green beans, butter beans. Okay, it's coming back. Green beans, butter beans. For those of you who don't know, butter beans are like lima beans. Pink-eyed purple hulls, which are like black-eyed peas, but they're pink eyes instead of black. And so she would grow all these southern vegetables in her garden and cook them, and so we'd have fresh vegetables every summer, and it was just wonderful. And she loved animals. She really loved animals. It started out as a little girl. Her mother kept chickens, and so she had a pet chicken I think she named it Henny, and she trained it to lie on its side with a bottle cap on its head. And one day, the woman who was cooking went out and caught this hen. She said, "Oh, it's so easy to catch." And my mom did not participate in that meal. So that was her first pet was Henny. And then years later, they were living in Redlands, and my sister went to pick out this cat named Tigger. He was a black cat. There's a picture of him that you'll see later on in the reception. and he was like my mom's familiar. He lived to be just 1 month short of 20 years old, and he was with her. And she would, as an example, my mom's intuition. She was a very intuitive woman. And my parents were away on a trip somewhere, and there was someone that was supposed to be looking after the cat, but I think he forgot, or I don't know the whole background of the story, but at any rate, my mom had this dream that the cat was in trouble. She had this dream and the cat was in trouble. And when they came back, the cat had been locked in the closet, unable to get out. So that's the kind of connection that she had. And the cat was fine. They let him out, and he survived. But that's just one example of the kind of intuition that she had. And there were many. So there was Tigger, and there were the horses. And though my dad was the primary horse rider, she had a relationship with the animals nonetheless, and she enjoyed being around them. And then there was Eleanor and Anna, the 2 dogs. And then Anna had puppies. And then there was Freddie. And I'll never forget. So Freddie was a little kind of poodle, half poodle, part terrier or something. We found him in the orange grove, and I'll never forget driving along in the car very slowly in the white Ford Taurus station wagon, and this little dog was running along, and he was trying to decide whether or not to get in the car with us. Finally he did, and he got in, and then my mom was the only one that he would let get close to him for a few months until he felt more secure. But so that's just one example of my mom's love of animals and her relationship with them. And of course, she was an excellent mother in many ways. I mean, we had our differences, but who doesn't? And she always hosted my birthday parties. She'd make cakes, and I'm sure she did the same thing for you, Anne-Marie. And she'd put cakes, and she'd put the little candy letters, that said happy birthday and the year, and have all my friends over. We'd play games, and she'd also lead us around the neighborhood kids. Brad Beswick was one, and me and maybe a couple other kids. And she'd give us toy instruments and tambourines. We'd walk through the neighborhood playing our tambourines and the toy instruments. And so that was good. And then when I was very young, my parents joined this church. Bruce Van Blair, whom some of you may remember, was preaching here at the time. He was the minister. And he was, in fact, the founding minister. And he was very dynamic, and my mom especially, both my parents resonated with this preacher, and so they became members of the church. And there were other young families in the church at that time. I particularly remember the Nafskers, the Hurleys, the Arths, the Beswicks, the Edishamis, the Meltzers, Judy and Floyd Orr and their children, and of course the Blakeleys, the Glanvilles, and slightly later on the Seidmans. These were all people who were important and whose children that I spent time growing up with and definitely influenced me in my career, in my life. And there were many other interesting and influential people in the church, and my mom and dad made relationships with all of them. And my mom was always about including people and welcoming them into the church. And she greatly valued her membership in the church and gave a lot of effort in her service to the church, engaging as the chair of the building committee that resulted in Covenant Hall, and served as the sanctuary for many years. And she also valued the teachings of Christ, but she was not an evangelist. She never forced me to believe in anything or insist that I follow a particular belief, as long as I treated people well. And I think Anne-Marie can say the same. And even when I was creating a lot of pain for her in the process of growing up, she was always reaching out and trying to help in the best way that she could. And another way my mother tried to make the world better was through her political involvement. She was greatly involved in civics, and she was the chair of the Redlands General Plan Committee. That was a lot of work, and then that kind of ended her. After that, she didn't get involved in politics so much because the city council promptly ignored all the work that this group of people had done. So that was unfortunate. And my mother was also very solicitous of ministers. She hosted several at her house in the room across from the main house where Jake is now staying. And As you may or may not know, I'm a Zen monk. There is, and in Zen and Buddhism, not just, this isn't just Zen, but in Buddhism, there's an image called the thousand-armed Kuan Yin, or in Sanskrit, Avalokiteshvara, which is translated as one who hears the cries of the world. So it's this Buddha with all these arms, or this bodhisattva, which means great being, with all these arms. And one interpretation of this is that we all have the capacity to be the hands of this bodhisattva, or God, if you prefer. And my mother was standing in the kitchen one day, and I was around the sliding glass door across from her, and we made eye contact, and she was looking at me with her blue eyes. And somehow this came up, and I said, "We are all God's hands." And she said, "You got it." So she just lived a life of compassion, using the tools given to her by her parents and her heritage and the community that she was a part of, in order to try and make her world a better place for all. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering what that would have been like if Anne Marie had presented it, because now I feel like we need to support you a little bit at the reception. There were a couple of challenging references in there, so your dad is going to put his arm around you, and so. Jim Tong is the music director here at RUCC, and I'm grateful that he's willing to lead us in a hymn which sort of represents the inclusiveness of what William has described as an openness in the Wesson family to use your mind and your experience and your intelligence to help you in discerning your relationship with the sacred. If you are able, we invite you to stand. And just to make things challenging for you, there are two hymns with this same title. We're inviting you to sing the one that is 395. It begins at the bottom of the page of the black hymnal that's in the pew rack in front of you or on the seat next to you. But if you're able, please stand.
In Christ there is no east or west, in Christ no south or north, but one community of love throughout the whole wide earth. In Christ shall true hearts everywhere their high communion find. God's service is a golden cord, close binding humankind. In Christ is neither Jew nor Greek, and neither slave nor free. For men and women live in God, and all are kin to me. In Christ now meet both east and west, in Christ meet south and north. One joyous true community throughout the whole wide earth.
You may be seated. Thank you. Let us pray. Gracious God, by your hand you have offered us life, and in your love you have given us new life in Jesus of Nazareth, who we have experienced and who we name as the Christ. We now entrust Carole and Wesson to your merciful care. We do this calling upon the promises of our faith, fully understanding that each person, each child of God, has an experience of you and a faith that is unique. We give you thanks for Carole's life. We give you thanks for the graciousness and generosity of this family that has been a part of this faith community for more than one generation. And we ask your blessing on each of us going forward, that as we remember, as we grieve, as we share our own needs and concerns, that we might also offer, as Carole did, our gifts and our love and our compassion and a concern for justice and a patience and a warmth and a spirit of humor that each of us has access to and may have forgotten how to share. Thank you, gracious God, for your Spirit, for your presence in this sharing today. And as we begin this process of remembering Carole, let us continue in the day and the weeks and the months ahead to thank you and thank others for Carole's presence in our lives and for all that she has meant. We ask this in the name of the one we call the Christ, and together God's people say, Amen. Then we'll play a postlude And again, Kristen, thank you for being here. Sophia, thank you for coming straight from school. And Jim, thanks for being a part of this service. As many of you know, music was so important to Carole and to the entire family. And both Craig and Carole have been a wonderful gift to the music ministry of this congregation. So thank you all for coming. I just want to clarify, excuse me for a moment, with William. Was it your mother, Carole, who taught Henny to lay on her side with a bottle cap on her? So I had prepared a traditional benediction, but for a woman who trains a hen to lay on its side with a bottle cap, can you imagine the time that it took to train that creature and then to explain to the creature why it was a bottle cap rather than some other thing? I think the only appropriate benediction, other than giving thanks for Carole's life and giving thanks to God, is to invite you all to say after me, "Roll Tide." Now, like a bunch of Northerners, that was very weak. And as you all know, in the state of Alabama, it's very similar to the state of Texas, that they're really interested in very few things other than whether you look like a suitable candidate to play football at the state university. So at UT, they meet you and they say, "It's nice to meet you," and then they lift up, hook 'em horns. So with apologies to anybody who went to Alabama State, if there is such a thing, let's try it again, and this time, do it in the spirit of saying, "I love you, Carole." Roll Tide. And together God's people say, Amen.
Amen.